Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right in to unpack literally the ultimate historical mystery, and we're going to uncover a massive superpower that somehow vanished without leaving a physical trace. Imagine a civilization so incredibly powerful it rivaled the greatest dynasties of Asia, controlling the absolute most crucial sea lanes on the planet. And yet, if you look at a standard history curriculum today, it's almost completely absent. Picture this, between the 7th and 13th centuries, the Srivijaya Empire absolutely dominated global trade, all the way from India to Japan. We're talking about a territory larger than European kingdoms of the time, and they accumulated absolutely unmatched wealth. But here's the crazy part. They left behind almost zero ruins. There is no Srivijayan equivalent to the Roman Colosseum, no towering stone monuments like Angkor Wat or Borobudur to serve as a beacon that they were ever even there. So you gotta ask, why has almost nobody heard of it? It's a massive historical paradox, right? How does an empire of this sheer magnitude just slip through the cracks of human memory? Well, today we are going to act as historical detectives. We're going to figure out exactly how a civilization of this epic scale was nearly erased from the historical record, and what we're actually doing right now to pull it back from the depths. The main reason they vanished really comes down to how we naturally picture empires versus what Srivijaya actually was. We're hardwired to think of land empires. You think of massive stone walls, fixed capitals, and defined borders you can easily draw on a map. But Srivijaya wasn't built on land and stone. This was a maritime empire, built entirely on water, ships, and sheer influence. Their true power lived in naval supremacy and port control. When you take that water-based, decentralized structure and drop it into a harsh, tropical, Southeast Asian climate, it's basically a recipe for invisibility. First off, the wood they used to build their magnificent coastal cities simply rotted away in the heat and humidity. Then, add in a Buddhist culture that was focused way more on spiritual practice than building giant vanity monuments. Throw in the tragic loss of their written records and a later cultural shift to Islamic rule that understandably didn't prioritize preserving the old Buddhist relics. Add all that up, and their physical footprint was wiped clean. Section 1. Mastering Maritime Choke Points. Controlling the Seas. Okay, so how did they actually do it? Well, it all comes down to geography, specifically the Strait of Malacca. Think of this as the ultimate global supply chain choke point. If you were a merchant in the ancient world and you were trying to get your goods from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, say traveling from India to China, this narrow little passage was the mandatory direct route. And a Srivijayan business model here was honestly genius in its simplicity. They basically set themselves up as the ultimate middleman. They levied inescapable taxes and tolls on every single ship passing through. But it wasn't just a shakedown, right? It was almost like a highly organized ancient protection scheme. You pay the hefty tolls, and in exchange, their highly advanced navy protects your ships from piracy. They guaranteed safe passage through some seriously dangerous waters. And then, of course, there was the cargo itself. Spices. We're talking cloves, nutmeg, mace, and pepper. Now keep in mind, these weren't just everyday flavorings back then, these were luxury commodities with staggering value. This was basically the Silicon Valley tech of the ancient world. By monopolizing the flow of these highly demanded Eastern spices out of the islands and funneling them into India, the Middle East, and eventually Europe, Srivijaya generated unimaginable wealth. They literally hold the keys to the world's most lucrative trade network. Section 2, Hub of Enlightenment, Center of Learning. But here's what's really fascinating. They didn't just ruthlessly tax merchants. They took all this vast maritime wealth and built massive intellectual capital. Buddhism was their state religion, and they invested heavily to make their empire the premier hub for Buddhist education and scholarship. They built this vast intellectual network. The famous Chinese monk Xuanzang visited, and scholars traveled from all over Asia just to study and copy texts there. They even had a deep, active connection with India's prestigious Nalanda University, utilizing Sanskrit as their main language for administration and high learning. So Srivijaya was essentially the cultural and intellectual beating heart of Southeast Asia. Section 3. Why did it vanish? The empire's decline. So that begs the question, how does a super wealthy, heavily armed empire just fall apart? Srivijaya wasn't a brief blip in history. As we can see here, they emerged around 650 CE in Sumatra, hit their absolute peak around 800 CE, and didn't completely disappear until the 1400s. They ruled for centuries, surviving a long time before facing a very gradual, painful decline. 750 years. Let that sink in for a second. That is how long they maintained power. It's an incredibly long lifespan that rivals or honestly even exceeds many of history's most famous, well-documented empires. And that eventual erasure makes this incredible longevity even more shocking. Their disappearance definitely wasn't an overnight collapse. It was more like a slow death by 1,000 cuts. It really started with these devastating naval invasions from the Chola Empire of India in 1025. That totally shattered the myth that Srivijaya was invincible, which led to internal fragmentation as tributary states started breaking away. Then, you have the land-based Majapahit Empire rising in Java to challenge them. Meanwhile, global merchants were getting more sophisticated and started just bypassing Srivijaya entirely for direct trade. And finally, the gradual Islamization of Southeast Asia naturally replaced the Buddhist heritage that had defined the empire. So slowly but surely, this great maritime power simply dissolved.
Section 4. Sunken Past. Uncovering Srivijaya.
Because their own written records are basically gone, historians are actively piecing this puzzle together right now using some pretty incredible methods. We scan official Chinese documents, where diplomats and traders were either complaining about or praising Srivijayan tolls. We look for passing mentions in Indian texts. We rely heavily on the meticulous, ongoing excavations in modern-day Palembang and Sumatra. But by far the most exciting part? We are relying on cutting-edge underwater archaeology.
This is where the story gets really thrilling. Recent underwater archaeology is literally still revealing Srivijaya's secrets. We're talking sunken ships, ancient anchors, and centuries-old maritime equipment found right at the bottom of the ocean. They're filling in the blanks for us. Srivijaya's history isn't locked away in some dusty textbook. It is actively being written today as divers pull new artifacts right off the seafloor.
And here is exactly why all of this matters to you and me today. Srivijaya's legacy is absolutely alive in our modern global supply chain. Right now, as we speak, massive cargo ships carrying billions of dollars in goods are navigating the exact same Strait of Malacca routes that were established and protected by Srivijayan navies a millennium ago. They essentially laid the blueprint for the maritime trade networks that power our entire modern global economy. Which leaves us with a fascinating and honestly pretty humbling thought. If an empire that controlled world trade, funded global education, and lasted for a staggering 750 years can just completely vanish into the jungle and the sea, what will remain of ours? It really makes you wonder what future underwater archaeologists might find of us 1,000 years from now. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history we think we know.